Master, I bring to mind that truth, and otherwise what we both share. Now, we start today the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, translated and annotated by James Haughton Woods. And this was published in 1927 by the Harvard University Press. So, like other books that I present, we are talking about something that is publicly available. So, the preface. Reasons for taking up the work. It is not without misgiving that one ventures to render into English the text of an intricate system which have never, with the exception of the sutras, been translated in Europe or America. But the historical importance of those texts as forming a bridge between the philosophy of ancient India and the fully developed Indian Buddhism and the religious thought of today in Eastern Asia emboldens one to attempt. For this system, together with the Nyaya and the Vaiceshika systems, when grafted upon the simple practical exhortations of primitive Buddhism, serves as an introduction to the logical and metaphysical masterpieces of the Mahayana. So just because Buddhism is later doesn't mean it's development, but in the 1800s and the early 1900s, that was typically the thought. Oh, later must be better. But the savage philosopher came later. Certain ideas with the savage philosopher came later. Just because Buddhism branched out of, just because Judaism branched out of and Christianity branched out of doesn't necessarily mean that they are better than their preceding paths. Difficulties of comprehending the work. Even after a dozen readings, the import of some paragraphs is not quite clear. Such, for example, as the first half of the Bhashya on 3:14. Still more intractable are the single technical terms, even if the general significance of the word, superficially analyzed, is clear. This irreducible Restudum is unavoidable so long as one cannot feel at home in that type of emotional thinking, which culminates in a supersensuous object of aesthetic contemplation. Difficulties of style, the Vyasya, and still more the Tattva Vaicharadi are masterpieces of philosophical style. Now, please excuse my attempts to read a transliteration, which may or may not agree with my own method of transliteration. They are as far from being a loosely collected body of glosses. Their excessively abbreviated and disconnected order of words is intentional. The Mimamsa discussed first the meaning of words, padartha, then in a distinct section the meaning of the sentences, vakyartha, and finally the most fully the implication, bhavartha, of the sentences as whole. Whether the sentence forming is lacking, I've introduced in brackets the words intended to make a declarative clause. Much more obscurity remains in the Bhavartha section of the Bhashya, for here many extraneous technical terms are surreptitiously introduced under the guise of exegesis. Thus, polemic with an opponent whose name is suppressed creeps into the argument. The allusions are suggestive, but obviously elusive. The passage at 3:14 might be quite simple if we had before us the text which it criticizes. Translation of technical terms. A system whose subtleties are not those of Western philosophers suffers disastrously when its characteristic concepts are compelled to masquerade under assumed names, fit enough for our linguistic habits, but the threadbare even for us by reason of frequent transpositions each time that Parusa is rendered by the word soul. Every psychologist and metaphysician is betrayed. No equivalent is found in our vocabulary. The rendering self is less likely to cause misunderstanding. Similarly, in accordance with the painstaking distinctions made at the end of 2.5, it is important to remember that the term avidya, although negative in form, stands for an idea which is not negative but positive, bearing in mind the express instructions of the text. I have adopted undifferentiated consciousness, but the translation of avidya, another word for which Professor Garba discusses more than 20 years ago in its translation of the Samkhya Pravachana Bhashya, Sutra 40, and 1. I don't know what A and M stands for. Maybe it's the word, because sutra and which section of the sutra, is guna. I prefer to translate this term by aspect rather than constituent, because in addition to the meanings, quality and substance, it often seems to have semantic value of subordinate, as correlated to pradhana. 3 other words, sattva and rajas and tamas, seem untranslatable unless one is content with half-meaningless etymological parallels. In another case, I've weakly consented to use elevation as equivalent to prasamkhyana. The original word denotes the culmination of a series of concentrations. The result is the merging of self in the object of contemplation. Function. Quotations from the sutras are enclosed in single angular quotation marks. Quotations from the Vyashya are enclosed in double angular quotation marks. Quotations from authoritative text are enclosed in ordinary double quotation marks. Objections and questions by opponents and quotations from unauthoritative texts are enclosed in ordinary single quotation marks. Hyphens have been used to indicate the resolution of compound words. A half parenthesis on its side is used to show that 2 vowels are printed in violation of the rules of euphonic combination. Lanman's Sanskrit Reader, page 289. Don't you just love how people look back at old text and say, this violates the language rules of a language that they spoke but I don't speak? Text and manuscripts. The text of the sutras of the yoga system, like that of the sutras of all the other 5 systems, except perhaps the Valchesika, is well preserved, and there is an abundance of excellent printed editions. The most accessible and most carefully elaborated of these books is the one published in the Ananda Trama series and edited by Kachinatha Shastri Aagchi. Variants from the 12 manuscripts, mostly southern, are printed at the foot of each page, and Bojadeva's Vritte is appended. Also, the text of the sutras by itself is and an index thereto. Aside from some examples, when you look at Jews printing editions of the Tanakh, you don't have too much of that, and there's way too many to even include when you're talking about the Bible, but you don't have too much of talking about variants. So there's an honesty when dealing with other texts that you don't have when people deal with the Bible. Another edition is the Bombay Sanskrit series by Rajaran Shastri Bodas. Is also an excellent piece of work. I have, however, made use of the edition by Swami Balarama from Calcutta, Sarvat, 1948, which is a reprint of the 1890, and Benares, AD 1908. It was reprinted in Benares in 1908, but it was an 1880 text. Because it is based on northern manuscripts and because of the valuable notes in the editor's Tapana of manuscripts I have collected with the kind of permission for the Maharaja during a charming week's visit at Jammu, below the glistening snows above the Pir Panjal, two of the oldest manuscripts in the library of the Raghunath Temple. In Stein's catalog, these are numbered 4,375 and 4,388, and the former is dated Sambat 1666. Two other manuscripts were lent, one by the courtesy of the most learned Gandhara Shastri, the other the very carefully written Bikaner manuscript, sent to me by the generosity of the Bikaner government, which proved to be extremely valuable for dispensed readings in the Tattva Vaicharadi. This later manuscript seemed to be about 150 years old and is described in Rajendralal Mitra's catalogue of Sanskrit manuscripts in the library of His Highness the Maharaja of Bikaner, and published in Calcutta in 1880, under the number 569, an old Sharada manuscript, which is by the kind mediation of Mukundaram Shastri of Srinagar, was put into my hands, proved upon critical examination to have been so badly corrupted as on the whole not to be worth recording. Acknowledgements. At the end of this book, at the end of one's tax comes the compensation of looking back to old scenes and to the friends and helpers who have watched the progress of the book. First of all, I remember the delightful visit on the island of Bahar, where, besides the long friendly walks upon the sands, I enjoyed an estimable opportunity of reciting and reading the Yoga Sutras with Professor de Usen. The next winter, at Benares, Mr. Arthur Venice opened the doors of the Sanskrit College to me, and with the utmost generosity smoothed the way through my first winter in India, and initiated me into the methods of many controversial sutras. Since my return, he has always been ready to assist, and I thank him for illuminating for me the perplexing debate on the Spata in 317. Besides all this, I am most grateful to him for an introduction to the lamented Shriman Mukunda Shastri Adkar, a scholar who has put the wealth of the ancient tradition and his own right scholarship at my disposal for many years. To many other scholars in Benares and in Kashmir and in Pune, I wish to express my thanks, especially to Dr. Shripad Krishna Balvakar and to Mr. V.V. Savani. To Professor Arthur W. Ryder of the University of California, I'm also much indebted. Furthermore, my thanks are due to Colonel George A. Jacob of the Bombay Staff Corps for his courtesy in searching after quotations, and to Frederick W. Thomas of the India Office Library for similar favors, too many to enumerate or repay. My deepest insight into the system and to what little I know of the philosophy of India I owe to Professor Hermann Jacobi of Bonn. Each visit to the little city on the Rhine adds to my debt of gratitude and reveals to me the beauty of the scholar's life. On my return from each visit to India, I laid the work in several stages before Professor Landmann, my teacher in my student days, and now my colleague. To him I owe the revision of the manuscript for the press, and a comparison of most of the translation, either in manuscript or proof with the original. His rigorous criticisms has detected many oversights which strike a fresh pair of eyes, and more quickly than those of the author. For his ready and ungrudging help through many years of intimate friendship, my hearty thanks. James Haughton Woods, July 1914. So it's been a good 100 years, or a bad 100 years, depending on how you look at it, but the introduction will be next. Namaste.